Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well. So in this video, I'll be going over the first part of chapter 13, which is on social psychology and the power of social influence. Before I start, I just wanted to talk a bit about my background. I'm currently working on my PhD in the Applied Social Psychology program at Windsor. My research focuses on aggression and risk-taking behaviors, more specifically aggressive driving, and how certain personality traits and motivational styles can predict aggressive driving behaviors. Social psychology is the branch of psychology that I think many people forget about or don't think of when they think of psychology as a whole, as I think many people think psychology mainly deals with mental illness, or they focus on the clinical or therapy aspects of psychology. Social psychology can be applied to pretty much any social situation, whether that be our behavior in our daily lives, our jobs, so through organizational psychology, or our relationships with others. So for this presentation, we'll be covering the first part of the social psychology chapter, so sections 13.1 and 13.2. This is just a quick overview of what this slideshow contains. So first we'll go over what social psychology is, then we'll talk about the main social psychology concepts, such as social comparison theory. There are also three famous experiments that we will discuss and also discuss how they influence the field of psychology. So these are Ash's conformity experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, and Milgram's obedience experiment. And we'll also discuss groupthink and some other related concepts. As an introduction, we'll start with defining what social psychology is and also the major concepts behind it. So social psychology is the study of how people influence others' behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes. Humans are a highly social species, and social psychology helps us understand how we can act helpful in some situations, or how we can be aggressive and even cruel in other situations. Social influence is extremely powerful, and it can be both good and bad. Most of the time, social influence are good, as they are adaptive in most circumstances, and they help us regulate cultural practices. So for example, wanting to be liked by others is something that benefits not only ourselves, but it also benefits those around us, as we're likely to treat others nicely if we want them to like us. However, there are also occasions where social influence can be harmful, such as when we blindly follow authority. And we'll speak more about that later in this presentation. Social influence also helps us understand how we can accept irrational and even pseudoscientific beliefs. And when I say we, I really mean we in this situation. Many people tend to believe that only others are vulnerable to social influence, but this isn't true. We are all vulnerable to these social influences, whether we are consciously aware of them or not. So, as I mentioned, humans are a highly social species, and thus they need to socially interact with others to thrive. So, the textbook mentions this need to belong theory, which was by Baumeister and Leary, and it states that humans have a biologically based need for interpersonal connections, and we can actually suffer negative psychological and physical consequences when we don't have these social bonds with others. Many studies examining social bonds have supported this theory, showing that social isolation can impair our mental functioning and even make us behave in destructive ways. We've seen this throughout history, that humans tend to have relatively small and tight social groups. According to the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, the approximate size of most human social groups is around 150 people. This is also similar to the average amount of Facebook friends a person has, which is why I've included a screenshot of a Facebook page on the slide. Now, in my experience, I see a lot of people who have hundreds, even thousands of Facebook friends, and you might be one of those people yourself, but in general, I think if you were asked, how many people or how many of those people you truly know and are friends with, the number is probably a lot closer to 150. Another core concept under social psychology that helps explain the magnitude of social influence is social comparison theory. Social comparison theory states that we evaluate our abilities and beliefs by comparing them to others' abilities and beliefs. This allows us to understand ourselves and the world around us better. We can socially compare ourselves in two different ways. One is through an upwards comparison, which is when we compare ourselves to people who seem superior to us in some way. And the other is through a downwards comparison, which is when we compare ourselves to people who seem inferior to us in some way. Both of these comparisons can boost our self-esteem or self-concept of ourselves. For example, when we compare ourselves to someone who outperforms us on a test, we may think, well, if they can achieve that high grade, then I can too. Or we can even spin this the other way and think, it's not that I'm dumb, it's because that person is a genius. Downward social comparison happens a lot when we watch reality TV shows, such as The Bachelor, and that's what makes them fun to watch, as watching others fail at their relationships often makes us feel better about our own lives and our own relationships. There are two other concepts that go along with social comparison. The first one is social contagion, which is when we turn to others in a situation that's ambiguous to us to figure out what to believe or how to behave. And similar to this is mass hysteria, which is a contagious outbreak of irrational behavior that spreads, much like a flu epidemic. Classic examples of mass hysteria can occur around UFO outbreaks, such as the example given in the textbook at the beginning of this chapter, where many people went into a complete panic after listening to a radio show which was describing an alien invasion that wasn't actually happening. Another example of a social contagion is through urban legends, which are false stories that have been repeated so many times that people then believe them. The examples that the textbook gave were not familiar to me, so I've included some in this slideshow that I thought would be more relevant. I'm a huge horror movie fan, so when I think of urban legends, I think of ones that are scary or spooky. So my first example is Slender Man. This one was big when I was younger, but I still think most people today have heard of it. There was even a movie made about Slender Man that came in a few years ago. The next is a Wendigo, which is a mythical creature based in indigenous folklore, and it actually originates from the Algonquin culture around the Great Lakes in Canada. If you've watched the TV show Hannibal, then this Wendigo creature will be familiar to you. And lastly, I think most people will remember the clown problem we had in 2016, where a bunch of clown sightings occurred throughout the United States, and people were telling stories that these clowns were taking children and hurting people. These clown sightings honestly caused some hysteria, as many people were scared, and some even started what they called clown hunts, where people would roam the streets with weapons, looking for people dressed as clowns to beat up. So from the research I've done about this, the clown sightings were never actually real, as there were never any evidence that people dressed as clowns were actually taking children, and this was simply the result of mass panic spreading through a few viral videos of clowns lurking the streets, and also people making false police reports. I read an interesting article which mentioned how the 2016 clown panic was actually not the first clown panic to happen, and that the United States actually has a history of clown panics. So I've left a link to this article in the video description if you're curious. Moving on to another core concept of social psychology, which is the fundamental attribution error. An attribution is when we assign causes to behavior. So, for example, we could say someone is acting very irritated because they are hungry. Attributions can be internal, such as our personality, or external, so depending on the situational factors, such as peer pressure. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency for people to overestimate the impact of internal or dispositional influences on behavior. And because of this, we also tend to underestimate the impact of situational factors on behavior. Many research studies have shown examples of the fundamental attribution error. So, as I mentioned earlier, my research focuses on aggressive driving, and we actually see the fundamental attribution error a lot in driving research. So, for example, one study found that when asked about others' driving behavior, most people will attribute aggressive or dangerous driving to dispositional attributions. So they'll say things like, well, they're just a bad driver. But when that's turned around and when you're asked about your own driving behavior, people mostly give situational attributions. So, for example, I was speeding because I was late for work. There also seems to be cultural factors that influence the fundamental attribution error, as Chinese and Japanese people seem to be less prone to this error, and this is likely based on their collectivist cultural views. Now we're moving into the section 2 of chapter 13. And first, I wanted to go over some terms before we move on into this section. These 3 terms all represent how social influence can impact someone's behavior. So the first term is compliance, which is doing what you have been asked to do by someone. And this is not necessarily by an authority figure. This could be through anyone. Conformity is going along with something even though there has been no request that you do so. So this is more about feeling pressured to follow what a group of people are doing, even when you haven't been told that you need to do so. And lastly, obedience is when you have been given a direct order by someone in authority, and therefore you do what you're told, even if you really don't want to. So first we'll discuss conformity. So conformity is the tendency to alter our behavior as a result of group pressure. A classic experiment demonstrating conformity was done by Solomon Asch in 1955, where he had participants judge which line out of 3 comparison lines was the same length as the standard line. And you can see a picture of this in the computer screen on the slide. In the description below this video, there's also a link to another YouTube video showing this experiment, as I think it's easiest to understand these experiments when you can actually see them as they're being explained. But I will do a quick explanation in this video. So Asch recruited participants and had all of them in the same room when they conducted this experiment. The catch was that for every experiment that he did, only one of the participants was actually a participant, and all the other people in the room were actually Confederates, and they were in on the experiment. So Asch would ask the participants which line was the same length as the standard line, and participants would give their answers out loud so that everyone could hear. However, the Confederates were actually instructed to give the wrong answer. So, for example, all the Confederates would say that line 1 was the correct answer, when it actually appears that line 2 is the correct answer. And Asch found that participants conformed to this wrong answer 37% of the time, and that 75% of participants conformed to the wrong answer for at least one of the 12 trials of the experiment that he did. So going back to the definition of conformity, these participants went along with what the group was saying, even if they likely believed it was the wrong answer, and even though they were not explicitly told that they needed to go along with all the group's answers. Following this experiment, Asch noted 3 social factors that seemed to influence how likely people were to conform. The first is unanimity. So if all of the Confederates gave the same wrong answer, the actual participant was more likely to conform to the wrong answer. The second was difference in the wrong answer. So if the Confederates gave more than one wrong answer, so for example, some said that it was line 1, but some also said that it was line 3, the actual participant was less likely to conform. And lastly, the size of the majority, or the Confederates, increased conformity, but only up to 5 to 6 Confederates. And he found that people were no more likely to conform in a group of 10 than in a group of 5. I have a few other noteworthy points on conformity. First is that social psychological research spanning over 60 years has consistently demonstrated the phenomena of conformity, and this is across experimental tasks, culture, and over time. So although conformity is a universal phenomena, there are also some differences that make people more likely to conform. Research has shown that having low self-esteem makes you more likely to conform, and also people from Asian cultures are more likely to conform. And this is likely because Asian cultures are more collectivist than North American cultures, and collectivism prioritizes group opinion as opposed to standing out from the group in individualistic cultures. And lastly, although it was originally thought that women would be more likely to conform than men, research actually shows that there's no sex differences in conformity. A process that makes us more vulnerable to conformity is that of de-individuation, which is the tendency for people to engage in atypical behavior when they are stripped of their usual identity. And there are many factors that contribute to de-individuation, but it's mainly due to anonymity and the lack of individual responsibility. We often see de-individuation occur in groups or crowds of people, as it's easier to be anonymous and diffuse your responsibility to others when you're in a group. Concealing your identity by wearing a mask or being in a dark room even can also contribute to de-individuation. One easy way for people to be anonymous is online and on social media. And this is why we often see people comment things or even show behavior that they would never do in person when they are posting online. We also see this in driving research, as the anonymity of driving a vehicle can cause people to drive recklessly and aggressively. And also, being under the influence of drugs and alcohol can also lead to de-individuation. So moving on to the second major experiment that we'll be discussing in this slideshow. This one was about social identities, and it was conducted by Philip Zimbardo in 1973, and it's known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. So Zimbardo and his colleagues wanted to examine the dehumanizing conditions of prisons and whether this stemmed from personality or more from taking on certain social roles that we are expected to adopt. The Stanford Prison Experiment involved 24 male participants who were randomly assigned to either the role of prisoner or guard. They transformed the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University to look like a prison, and even had research assistants arrest the prisoners at their homes and bring them into the prison cells in the basement. The prisoners and guards wore clothes that were based on their roles, and the guards were instructed to only refer to the prisoners by numbers and not by their names. The experiment was originally supposed to last 2 weeks. However, it ended up only lasting 6 days as things escalated pretty quickly. The guards subjected the prisoners to harsh punishments, such as cleaning dirty toilets with their bare hands and also stripping them naked. By day 2, The prisoners had planned a rebellion against the guards, which only caused the guards to punish them more. Some prisoners began to show signs of psychological distress, including depression and hopelessness, which ultimately caused the experiment to be shut down. So, in the description below this video, I have linked another video that you can watch where they describe this experiment in more detail and also how it relates to another similar situation that occurred in an Iraqi prison, which the textbook discusses. Although the Stanford prison experiment was incredibly influential, there are a lot of criticisms of the experiment. The first is replicability, which, as a reminder, is the study's ability to be replicated or not, or in other words, whether you can achieve the same results when conducting the experiment again. So, replicability is important in psychology because it allows researchers to test the findings of research and it gives us more confidence in these findings. Unfortunately, replicability is a huge issue in social psychology, as many experiments do not replicate, and this includes the Stanford prison experiment. Additionally, there were two main criticisms of the experiment. One was that it wasn't carefully controlled, and it's thought that the participants may have experienced demand characteristics to behave accordingly to their assigned role as either the prisoner or the guard. The second criticism is that the participants recruited were not actually average people per se, and that they were likely higher in aggression and narcissism and lower in altruism and empathy, which would likely make them be a lot more aggressive than the general population. This criticism was actually based on a study examining participants who signed up for a study using the exact same advertising that Zimbardo and his colleagues used for the original Stanford prison experiment. So, because of all this, a major conclusion from the Stanford prison experiment was that it actually demonstrates the influence of individual differences on conformity and less about the influence of delegating different social roles to individuals. So, in other words, not every person who becomes a prison guard will behave in cruel ways. Likely only those who are higher in these types of personality traits like narcissism, those who are higher in aggression, would be the individuals who are likely to act out in very aggressive ways in these situations. Lastly, I did just want to touch on the, ethical components of the Stanford prison experiment. As I mentioned, this experiment is extremely influential and still gets brought up in psychology to this day. But instead of focusing on the findings, what gets talked about more is actually how this is an example of what not to do in psychological research. There were many ethical issues that occurred, mainly with how the prisoners were treated and how the experiment likely carried out longer than it should have. There's even some speculation that Zimbardo himself did not want the experiment to end, but his grad student actually had to beg him to stop it. There is also a movie created about the Stanford prison experiment. It used to be on Netflix, but I don't think it is anymore. If you can find it somewhere, it is a decent watch, although I will add, I believe it's not 100% accurate to the actual experiment and the real life events that took place. So, moving on to another social psychology concept, groupthink is a phenomenon that occurs when an emphasis is given to group unanimity, and this is at the expense of critical thinking. In these situations, groups can sometimes make good decisions. However, oftentimes the common knowledge among the group is used as the answer, as opposed to using the unique knowledge of individual members of the group. And this common knowledge is often wrong, which ultimately can lead to poor group decisions. Groupthink can often lead intelligent people to make very bad decisions, and in its extreme form is where we see things like cults. Cults are groups that exhibit intense and unquestioning devotion to a single cause. And now, not all cults end badly, but we have seen a few examples where cults have seriously harmed people, such as with the Heaven's Gate cult. Most people think that in order to get involved with a cult, you have to be emotionally disturbed or even unintelligent, but this isn't true. Research shows that most cult members are actually psychologically normal. Therefore, believing that cult members are emotionally disturbed is just another example of the fundamental attribution error, as emphasis is placed on the cult member's individual personality and not on external factors like social influence. Similar to this is how many people do not believe that they would ever fall under the spell of a cult, as they believe cult members are brainwashed. However, this also isn't true and is an example of how we don't think of ourselves as being as vulnerable to social influences as other people. And I just wanted to add the textbook mentions that to avoid groupthink, one of the best recommendations is to always have a group member play the devil's advocate in group decisions. So, someone who gives doubt on the decisions being made so you can avoid only using the common knowledge decision. So, next we'll move on to obedience, which is defined as adherence to instruction from those of higher authority. So, authority is an important component to obedience, unlike in compliance, which does not need authority. Obedience is an essential ingredient in our daily lives. It's important that we are all obedient to some extent, as it allows our world to function. So, for example, when we're driving, we need to be obedient to follow the traffic laws and stop at stop signs, etc. However, obedience can be problematic when we unquestionably follow orders from those who are in authority and we don't ask why we're behaving as others want us to. A famous study investigating obedience was conducted by Stanley Milgram, and he was actually a graduate student of Solomon Asch. So Milgram was interested in how the Holocaust could have occurred, and he wanted to examine how far authority could go and if he could ask people to harm others with authority. In the 1960s, he recruited volunteers for a study, telling them that it was about people's memory of words. Volunteers would be greeted by the researcher, who was in a white lab coat, and another volunteer who was actually a Confederate, so they were in on the experiment. The Confederate would go into another room and was instructed to listen to words and then repeat them. So they were known as the learner in this experiment. The volunteer was considered the teacher, and the volunteer and the main researcher were in a different room listening. And if the Confederate got a word wrong, the volunteer was instructed to shock the Confederate. And the volunteers were told the Confederate was hooked up to an instrument that would give them a shock that was similar to a static shock, but this actually wasn't true. The Confederates weren't hooked up to anything, and they weren't actually getting shocked. They were just pretending to be shocked. So with each wrong word, the shocks would progressively get worse. They would go from a slight shock to a shock that was labeled as danger, severe shock. And the Confederates even cried out in pain or would ask the volunteer to stop as the shocks got more severe. And the researcher would continue to tell the volunteer to go on and deliver the shocks, even when many volunteers seemed very reluctant to do so. In the original study, all participants administered at least some of the shocks, and 62% of participants actually showed complete compliance. So they administered all of the shocks, all the way up to the highest voltage of 450 volts. I've also linked a video going over this experiment in more detail in the description box. I think this experiment is really interesting to watch, as I think, just learning about this experiment, many people wouldn't believe that they would actually shock somebody, even if someone else was telling them to do so. And, you can hear the Confederates crying out in pain and asking them to stop. And, even though many of the participants were very reluctant to continue shocking, as soon as the researcher told them to continue, most of them would. And it's really surprising to see. So, to further understand the findings of the original experiment, Milgram went on to conduct a variety of follow up studies that all had slight variations to the original. And from all of these experiments, two key themes emerged. The first was that obedience decreased with greater psychological distance between the teacher, who was the volunteer, and the experimenter. So, for example, one experiment had the researcher instructing the volunteer to shock the Confederate over the phone as opposed to being in the same room as the volunteer. The second theme was that obedience increased with increasing psychological distance between the teacher and the learner, or the Confederate. So, for example, one variation had the volunteer instruct another volunteer to administer the shocks. And this actually increased the complete compliance rate from 62% to 93%. And this can be explained by the lack of personal responsibility, since the volunteer was not actually the one giving the shocks, they were only giving the orders. So on this slide, you can see the graph that's depicting the shock levels in volts. So from slight all the way to XXX, and the percentage of subjects who actually obeyed the researcher or experimenter. And this graph is also in the textbook. So the results of Milgram's experiments provided a lot of understanding around who would be more likely to disobey authority figures, and alternatively, what predicts obedience. Most personality variables do not appear to be a predictor of obedience, as participants who obeyed and disobeyed showed similar scores on many different personality variables. Moral development, however, was a predictor of obedience, as more morally advanced participants were more willingly to defy the researcher's orders. A person's level of authoritarianism also predicted obedience, as those with higher levels of authoritarianism were more likely to obey others. Milgram found no evidence of sex or cultural differences in obedience, and these findings have actually been replicated in other countries. There are still some criticisms of Milgram studies, though, and these are very similar to those of Zimbardo's prison experiment. So they suspect demand characteristics may have played a role in these experiments. However, the findings of these studies definitely revolutionized how we think about obedience, and they also demonstrate the extreme social influence of authority. So that concludes this presentation on the first part of Chapter 13. As a final note, I do just want to reiterate the importance of the three experiments I've mentioned. So that's Asha's Conformity experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, and Milgram's obedience experiment. These experiments will continually be brought up throughout your undergrad courses, and although they may not have been the best examples of good experiments, and all of them have some issues with how they were conducted, they are still extremely influential, and the results of these studies are still used today to discuss how people behave in certain situations. Before you click off this video, make sure to check out all of the videos and resources that I've linked below in the description box. There are some videos on the content that I've covered, including the videos on all three of the experiments, as I mentioned, and a few other videos on social influence, and also the crash course video on social psychology. I've also linked some articles on the information I talked about, including the article on the fundamental attribution error in driving behavior. Be sure to watch Dr. Susie's video on the second half of Chapter 13 on Blackboard, which goes over topics such as aggression and the bystander effect. If you have any questions about any of the content I covered in this video, you can feel free to comment down below of this video on YouTube. That way I can answer your questions and everyone can see the answers, just in case people have similar questions. You can also send me an email though if you'd prefer. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this video and learned something new. Bye for now.